I remember the day everything changed like it was yesterday. I was just 9 years old, sitting at our kitchen table, when Mom and Dad sat down with serious faces I'd never seen before. Dad reached for my hand, his own trembling slightly. "Amber, sweetheart," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to tell you something important." That was the day we learned about the cancer. I didn't fully understand what it meant then, but I understood enough to know that my world was about to turn upside down. For the next 2 years, our cozy house became a revolving door of doctors, relatives, and well-wishers. I watched my father, once strong and vibrant, slowly fade away. Mom tried to keep things normal, but nothing was normal anymore. She'd force smiles during the day, but at night, I'd hear her crying in their bedroom. I'd sit outside their door, wanting to go in, but not knowing what to say. When Dad passed away, I was 11. The funeral was a blur of black clothes and hushed voices. Mom held my hand so tight it hurt, but I didn't mind. I thought we'd get through it together. I was wrong. A week after the funeral, Mom sat me down again, this time alone. "Amber, I've been talking to your grandmother," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "I think it would be best if you stayed with her for a little while. Just until I can get things sorted out." "But why can't I stay here with you?" I asked, my voice small. "I need some time alone, honey, to process everything, to figure out how to move forward." She tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, but the gesture felt hollow. "It'll just be for a few months." Grandma Margaret, Dad's mother, picked me up the next day. She didn't say much during the drive to her house, but I could see her knuckles white on the steering wheel. When we arrived at her modest 2-story home, she helped me carry my bags to the guest room. Over the next few months, Mom would call every few weeks. The conversations always followed the same pattern. "When can I come home, Mom?" "Just be patient, sweetie. Just a little longer." "But I miss you." "I miss you too. But this is better for now. You understand, right?" I didn't understand. Neither did Grandma, though she never said it outright. She'd just press her lips together whenever Mom called, her disapproval clear in the way she'd busy herself in the kitchen, banging pots and pans a little louder than necessary. Grandma made sure I never felt unwanted. She'd cook my favorite meals, help me with homework, and tell me stories about Dad when he was young. But no matter how comfortable I was at Grandma's, it wasn't home. I kept waiting for Mom to come back for me, to want me again. After 6 months at Grandma's, Mom finally came for me. I was doing homework at the kitchen table when I heard a car pull up outside. Through the window, I saw Mom step out of an unfamiliar blue sedan. A man I'd never seen before stayed in the driver's seat. "Amber," Mom burst through the door, more animated than I'd seen her since Dad died. Her hair was styled, her makeup fresh, and she was wearing a new dress. "I've got wonderful news." Grandma appeared from the living room, arms crossed. "Sarah, this is unexpected." "Mom, Amber, I want you to meet someone special." Mom was practically bouncing. "Well, he's waiting in the car. He's a bit shy about coming in, but..." She grabbed my hands. "Amber, honey, I'm getting married. His name is Robert, he's absolutely wonderful. A successful businessman, and he has 2 daughters about your age. You'll have sisters, isn't that exciting?" I looked at Grandma, whose face had turned to stone. "Sarah," Grandma's voice was careful, measured. "Don't you think this is a bit sudden?" "Oh, Margaret, when you meet him, you'll understand. He's perfect for us. Amber, he's going to be such a wonderful stepfather to you. And his girls, Emma and Lisa, they're 9 and 10. Their mother passed away 3 years ago, and Robert's raised them alone. We're going to be one big, happy family." I peered out the window at the man in the car. He was staring straight ahead, not even glancing toward the house. "Come on, Amber," Mom said, already gathering my things. "Let's go home. The girls are waiting to meet you." The drive home was filled with Mom's chatter about Robert, the wedding plans, and how perfect everything would be. When we pulled up to our house, the house Dad and Mom had bought together, two girls were sitting on the front steps. They looked like matching dolls, with their identical blonde hair and pink dresses. "Girls," Mom called out, waving. "Come meet Amber." I stepped forward, trying to smile. "Hi, I'm..." "We know who you are," the taller one, Emma, cut me off. Her voice was sweet as honey, but her eyes were cold. "Our dad told us all about you." "Yeah," Lisa, the younger one, chimed in. "But just so you know, he's not going to be your dad. He's our dad. And your mom is going to be our new mom," Emma added with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We're going to be one big happy family. Right, Sarah?" "Of course, sweetie," Mom beamed, completely missing the tension. 3 months later, I stood in front of a mirror in a plain blue dress while Emma and Lisa twirled around in matching pink bridesmaid gowns. The wedding was about to start, and I could still hear the echoes of their screaming from earlier. "We won't wear the same dress as her," they'd shrieked when Mom suggested matching dresses for all three of us. "She's not even really part of the family." In the official wedding photos, I'm barely visible, thanks to Emma and Lisa strategically positioning themselves to block me out. As I stared at those photos later, I realized this wasn't going to be the happy family Mom had promised. Life in our blended family quickly settled into a routine. Robert wasn't cruel, he just acted like I was invisible. He'd come home from work, hug Emma and Lisa, kiss Mom, and walk right past me as if I were a piece of furniture. Mom, desperate to prove her devotion to her new husband, showered his daughters with attention while barely sparing a glance my way. The first Christmas after the wedding made it crystal clear where I stood. Emma and Lisa each got new iPads and designer clothes, while I received a basic phone and some discount store sweaters. Thank God for Grandma Margaret. She never forgot me. For my 13th birthday, she gave me a beautiful silver locket with Dad's picture inside. Emma spotted it around my neck at dinner. "That's so pretty," she said, eyes gleaming. "You should share it with me. That's what sisters do." When I refused, I found the locket's chain mysteriously broken the next day. Another time, Grandma sent me a limited edition set of art supplies. I loved drawing, just like Dad had. A week later, I found my sketchbook soaked in water and the expensive pencil snapped in half. When I confronted Lisa, she just smiled. "Prove it was me," she said sweetly. "Mom," I tried showing her the ruined supplies. "Look what they did." "Amber, stop being dramatic," Mom sighed. "You probably left them out in the rain yourself. Stop trying to blame your sisters for everything." Then, when I turned 15, Mom dropped another bombshell: she was pregnant. The house exploded with excitement, everyone except me, that is. Robert's daughter squealed about having a baby brother or sister, while I sat quietly, already knowing what this would mean. The baby, a boy they named Michael, arrived in spring. 3 weeks after Mom came home from the hospital, they called a family meeting in the living room. "Now that Michael's here," Mom began, not quite meeting my eyes, "we need to make some changes to the sleeping arrangements." Robert cleared his throat. "We think it would be best if you moved in with Emma and Lisa. Michael needs his own room." "No," the word came out before I could stop it. "I'm not sharing a room with them. This is my room. This is my father's house." The room went silent. "What did you say?" Mom whispered. "Dad bought this house," I continued, my voice growing stronger. "He paid for it. You and your daughters moved into our house, and now you want to take my room away?" Robert's face turned red. Emma and Lisa sat with their mouths open, for once speechless. "How dare you?" Mom's voice shook. "How can you be so selfish? After everything we've done for you?" Tears started rolling down her cheeks. "Robert has been nothing but good to you, and this is how you repay us?" "Good to me?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "He doesn't even look at me." After that, the house became even more of a prison. Nobody spoke to me at meals. Mom and Robert acted like I wasn't there, and Emma and Lisa didn't even bother with their usual taunts, they just pretended I was invisible. The silence was somehow worse than their cruelty had been. After 3 days of complete silence in the house, I couldn't take it anymore. I picked up my phone and called the one person who had never let me down. When Grandma's car pulled into the driveway, I saw Mom and Robert watching from the kitchen window. As I walked out with my backpack, they didn't try to stop me. If anything, they looked relieved. Life at Grandma's felt like being able to breathe again after years of holding my breath. We fell into an easy routine: breakfast together every morning, homework at the kitchen table while she baked, long talks about Dad and what he was like at my age. 2 months passed quickly. Then one morning, Grandma sat me down with her serious face on. "Amber, I need to tell you something," she said, taking my hands in hers. "I've been talking to your mother. She's willing to give up her parental rights. And I want to adopt you, officially." I stared at her, hardly daring to believe it. "Really? Really? It's your choice, of course. But I want you to know that this has always been your home, and I would be honored to be your legal guardian." Tears welled up in my eyes as I hugged her. "Yes, please, yes." The legal process was surprisingly smooth. Mom signed the papers without hesitation. The only thing left was to get my remaining belongings from the house. When I went back, no one was home. I found all my things packed in boxes in the garage, covered in dust. My old room had been completely transformed into a nursery for Michael, painted blue with clouds on the ceiling. I loaded my boxes into Grandma's car without saying goodbye. They hadn't bothered to say goodbye to me, after all. High school was different now. Emma and Lisa still attended the same school, but we existed in parallel universes. We'd pass each other in the hallways without a glance, like strangers who had never shared a home. Sometimes I'd hear them laughing with their friends, talking about family vacations or weekend plans, but it was like listening to a radio station playing in another room, distant and disconnected from my reality. I threw myself into my studies, determined to make something of myself. Grandma supported me every step of the way, helping me with college applications and encouraging me to aim high. The day my acceptance letter arrived from State University, along with a partial scholarship offer, Grandma was more excited than I'd ever seen her. "I have something to tell you," she said that evening. "I've been saving for your college fund since the day your father died. I wanted to make sure you'd have options." The amount she had saved left me speechless. With the scholarship covering most of my tuition, we decided together to save most of the money for my future. I'd need it someday for grad school, or maybe to start my own life after college. Those first few years of college were transformative. I called Grandma every Sunday, visited during holidays, and finally felt like I was building my own life. My mother, Robert, and their perfect little family became distant memories, like characters in a story I'd read long ago. The call came during my final semester of senior year. "Amber," Grandma's voice was weaker than I'd ever heard it. "The doctors found something." I started making the trip home every weekend after that. Each time, Grandma seemed a little frilier, a little more tired. But she never lost her spirit. "Don't you dare skip any classes for me," she'd insist, even as the hospital machines beeped around her. "I didn't save all that money for your education just for you to play nursemaid to an old woman." When graduation day came, Grandma was too weak to attend. The nurses helped prop her up in her hospital bed, and we set up her smartphone so she could watch the live stream. After I crossed the stage and got my diploma, I looked directly into the camera and blew her a kiss. Later, she told me she'd cried through the whole ceremony. I went straight from graduation to the hospital. For the next week, I barely left her side. We talked about everything and nothing: memories of Dad, her childhood stories, her hopes for my future. Then one quiet morning, while I was holding her hand, she slipped away peacefully in her sleep. Planning the funeral felt surreal. I was choosing flowers and making arrangements in the same house where Grandma and I had shared breakfast just weeks ago. Then, on the day of the service, I saw them. My mother, Robert, Emma, Lisa, and a young boy I barely recognized as my half-brother Michael walked into the funeral home. 7 years had changed them. Emma and Lisa were now grown women, and Michael, who I'd last seen as a baby, was now a grade schooler in a small black suit. The ceremony passed in a blur. I stood alone by the casket, accepting condolences from distant relatives and Grandma's friends. Then suddenly, Mom was there. "Amber," she said softly, her eyes red from crying. "I'm so sorry for your loss." "Margaret, she was a wonderful woman." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "Listen," Mom continued, twisting her hands together nervously, "I know it's been a long time, but would you consider coming to dinner with us? All of us? We'd like to try to make things right." Looking at her face, lined now with age and grief, I felt the weight of all our unsaid words. "I'll think about it," I managed to say. A week later, after meeting with Grandma's lawyer and learning she'd left me everything, the house, her savings, all of it, I made my decision. Maybe it was time to face the past. The house I'd grown up in looked smaller somehow, shabbier. The paint was peeling, the garden overgrown. Inside, Robert, Emma, Lisa, and Michael were waiting around the dining room table. The awkward silence was broken only by the clinking of silverware against plates. "So," Mom finally said, forcing brightness into her voice, "what are your plans now that you've graduated?" I took a slow sip of water before answering. "I'm staying in town, actually. Going to live in Grandma's house." The flash of satisfaction in Mom's eyes was quick, but I caught it. Something about that look made me uneasy, though I couldn't say why. My degree in business administration landed me a position as a junior executive at Wilson & Associates. The salary was more than I'd ever dreamed of making right out of college, and with no rent to pay thanks to Grandma's house, I was able to save a good portion of my earnings. Mom started dropping by regularly, usually with fresh-baked cookies or a casserole. At first, our conversations were awkward, filled with long pauses and careful words. But gradually, she began opening up about their struggles. The heating bill was so high this month, she'd sigh, or Michael's growing so fast, he needs new shoes again. The first time I offered help, it was almost automatic. Mom was talking about a leaky faucet they couldn't afford to fix. "I have some extra cash," I said, pulling out $200. "Here, get it fixed." The way her face lit up made something warm stir in my chest. After that, it became a regular thing, small amounts here and there for whatever crisis they were facing that week. Then, surprisingly, Emma and Lisa started coming around too. They told me about their jobs, Emma as a receptionist, Lisa working retail, and their struggles to make ends meet. It was strange hearing them talk without any trace of their old meanness. When Mom mentioned that Michael needed a laptop for school, I didn't hesitate. The smile on his face when I gave it to him made all our past history seem distant and unimportant. "You're the best big sister ever," he said, hugging me. It was our first real hug. The real breakthrough came during my business trip to New York. When Emma and Lisa asked if they could tag along, I was hesitant at first, but their excitement was contagious. "We've never been anywhere," Lisa admitted. "Dad always said we couldn't afford it." I booked them economy tickets and found a decent tourist-class hotel in Manhattan. Watching them experience New York for the first time was like seeing the city through new eyes. They took pictures of everything, gasped at the height of the skyscrapers, and couldn't stop talking about how amazing it all was. During our dinner at a small Italian restaurant in Little Italy, Emma raised her glass of house wine. "To family," she said, and for the first time, the word didn't feel wrong. Back home, our regular dinners became a tradition. Mom, Emma, and Lisa would always insist on choosing budget-friendly restaurants, and they never ordered anything expensive. They seemed genuinely grateful for everything, no matter how small. Mom's call came on a Tuesday afternoon, just like any other. I was reviewing work documents when my phone lit up with her name. "Hi, sweetie," her voice was warm, familiar. "How are you doing?" We chatted about nothing in particular, Michael's school performance, Emma's new haircut, the usual family gossip. Then, just as we were wrapping up, she added, "Oh, by the way, honey. I hate to ask, but could you maybe transfer $200? The car needs some minor repairs. Sure, Mom. I'll send it right now. You're an angel, Amber. I love you so much. I was about to hang up when I realized the call hadn't ended. There was rustling on the other end, then voices growing clearer. Mom must have thought she'd pressed the end button. Did she fall for it? That was Emma's voice, followed by a laugh I hadn't heard since high school, sharp, mocking. Of course she did. Mom's voice had changed completely, dripping with contempt. She always does. Little Miss successful with her fancy job and her inherited house. God, I'm so tired of pretending to like her, Lisa groaned. Did you see what she was wearing at dinner last week? That awful blazer? She thinks she's so much better than us just because she went to college. They all laughed, Mom, Emma, and Lisa. Then I heard Robert's voice join in. You're doing great, honey, he told Mom. Keep it small for now. We don't want to spook her. I know, Mom replied. We have to play it smart. Small amounts here and there, build up her trust. Once she completely lets her guard down, then we can really start asking for more. She's loaded now, that house, her savings, her salary. We just need to make sure she spends it on us, instead of herself. It's not fair, Emma whined. Why should she have all that money? We deserve it more than she does. Of course you do, sweetheart, Mom said. You and Lisa are twice the daughters she ever was. Don't worry, we'll get what's ours. She's too stupid to see what's really going on. Always was, just like her father. I ended the call with a single press of my finger, but their laughter kept echoing in my ears. The family I thought I'd finally found had never existed. It had all been an elaborate performance, with me playing the role of the foolish benefactor. The next morning, Mom's number flashed on my phone screen. Amber, honey. We're having a special family dinner tonight. You'll come, won't you? I heard the false sweetness in her voice now, the calculated warmth that I'd been too desperate to recognize before. Sure, Mom. What time? 7 o'clock. Everyone will be there. When I arrived at the house, they were all waiting. Mom had made my favorite lasagna. Emma and Lisa were dressed up, playing their roles perfectly. Even Michael seemed to have been coached to be extra affectionate. Amber, Mom rushed to hug me. You look tired, sweetie. Work keeping you busy? I returned her hug mechanically, noting how she exchanged quick glances with Robert. Throughout dinner, they kept up their performance, asking about my job, laughing at each other's jokes, playing the perfect family. I watched them like I was seeing a play, noticing every forced smile, every calculated gesture. Finally, as we were finishing dessert, Mom cleared her throat. Amber, honey, we actually wanted to talk to you about something important. She reached for Robert's hand, their practiced move for serious conversations. The house, well, we've had some structural issues come up. The foundation needs urgent repairs. We've gotten estimates, Robert added, trying to sound fatherly. It's going to cost about $10,000. Mom leaned forward, her eyes wide and hopeful. We hate to ask, but since you're doing so well. I smiled, and I saw Mom's face light up with triumph. She thought she had me. No. The word fell into the silence like a stone into still water. What? Mom's smile faltered. I said no. Not 10,000, not $10. Not another cent. Emma and Lisa exchanged confused looks. Robert sat up straighter. But honey, Mom started, we really need. You forgot to hang up the phone yesterday, Mom, I kept my voice calm, almost conversational. After you asked for that $200. The color drained from her face. Emma and Lisa froze. Even Michael, who probably didn't understand what was happening, stopped eating his cake. I heard everything, I continued. About how tired you are of pretending to like me. About how you've been playing me for money. About how you think I'm stupid, just like my father. I turned to Emma and Lisa. About how you deserve my money more than I do. We were just joking, Lisa burst out. It wasn't serious. Amber, sweetie, Mom reached for my hand. I pulled it away. You're misunderstanding. The only thing I misunderstood was thinking you had changed. I stood up from the table. But you know what? I should thank you. You've finally shown me who you really are, and now I can stop wasting my time trying to build a relationship with people who see me as nothing but an ATM. I walked out of that house for the last time, ignoring their calls behind me. But of course, they didn't give up easily. The calls started that night, first Mom, then Robert, then the sisters. Voicemails, text messages, emails, all begging forgiveness, claiming it was just a joke, that I was overreacting. When I blocked their numbers, they started showing up at my house, knocking on my door at all hours. I knew I needed a clean break. The next morning, I walked into my boss's office. Janet, remember when you mentioned expanding the New York office? 2 weeks later, I had a transfer approval in hand. I listed Grandma's house with a realtor, and it sold quickly, the market was good, and it was in a prime location. I found a beautiful apartment in Manhattan's Upper West Side, with big windows and a view of the park that would have made Grandma smile. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I think about them, Mom, Robert, Emma, Lisa, and little Michael. I hope Michael grows up to be different from them. But I don't regret my decision. I learned that family isn't about blood or legal documents. It's about love, real love, not the kind that comes with price tags and hidden fees.
This story is titled, My Cheating Ex-Wife Sued Me, thinking she will get the house and my money, but in the end, she lost and had to pay child support. Karma is a bitch. Hey everyone, if you're enjoying these stories and want to support the channel, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It really helps our channel. Now let's start the video. OP starts by saying, Hi all, I don't usually post personal stuff here, but I wanted to tell this story because it's been a wild ride, and honestly, I could use some outside perspective, or maybe just some validation. I'll give you some context of how and why we divorced before exposing her after divorce games. Bear with me. So, when my ex-wife, Sarah, female, and I, male, decided to have kids, it felt like the start of a new chapter in life, one filled with promise. At the time, I was 32, working as an engineer, and earning enough to give us a comfortable lifestyle. Sarah, at 29, was doing well as a marketing associate. We were a team, or so I thought. The first sign that things were shifting came shortly after our daughter Emma was born. Sarah sat across the dinner table one evening, pushing around the food on her plate, and said, I think it's time I quit my job. She made it sound so practical, like it was all about the baby. Daycare is expensive, and you're doing so well at work. It just makes sense, she explained. I didn't push back much. I loved Emma, and if staying home with her made Sarah happy, I figured it was a win-win. But within a week, her priorities started showing themselves. The first request was a new car. Her old sedan wasn't cutting it anymore. Do you really want me driving our baby around in something that unreliable? She asked. I caved. It seemed reasonable at the time. Then came the clothes. None of my pre-baby wardrobe fits, she said, as if she hadn't been complaining about her outdated style even before Emma was born. When I hesitated, she threw in, It's not just for me. I need to look put together for Emma's sake. Spa appointments soon became a weekly thing. Her reasoning? Pregnancy changes your body in ways you'll never understand. At first, I didn't say anything. She'd been through a tough pregnancy, and I thought she deserved to feel good about herself. But as the months went on, it started to feel less like Sarah was focusing on Emma and more like she was focusing on herself. I'd come home after a 10-hour shift to find Sarah scrolling through her phone, Emma playing alone in her playpen. When I'd suggest we spend some time together as a family, Sarah would sigh and say, I've been with her all day. You take over for a while. Bedtime routines were completely on me. I was fine with it at first, but because of my job, I needed some help too. As Emma grew older, Sarah's spending habits didn't slow down. She joined a mom's group, but treated it more like a social club than a support network. She'd meet her friends for lunch at upscale cafes, always ordering the most expensive items on the menu. When I suggested we set a budget to manage our growing expenses, Sarah laughed. What's the point of making all this money if we're going to live like we're broke? She said. It stung. I'd been working overtime, missing out on moments with Emma, and Sarah's response felt dismissive. By the time our son, Ethan, who was 2 years old, the cracks in our relationship had turned into chasms. Sarah kept doing the same things, spent her days shopping online, planning vacations we couldn't afford, and attending fitness classes. Any talk of cutting back was met with resistance. "It's for the kids," she'd say. But it was hard to see how her latest designer handbag was benefiting Emma or Ethan. Her disdain for any kind of parenting responsibility became clearer with time. When Emma started preschool, Sarah rarely attended parent-teacher meetings. "What's the point?" she said. "It's not like they're teaching calculus." I started to feel like a single parent, even though Sarah was physically present. The late-night feedings, the tantrums, the scraped knees, those were all on me. And whenever I brought up how I felt, Sarah turned it into an attack on me. "You're always at work," she'd say. "Maybe if you were more present, I wouldn't have to take on so much." It felt unfair. She wasn't taking on much of anything, but any attempt to say so led to arguments. I was exhausted. Looking back, I should have seen it coming. The small requests that turned into big demands. The dismissive comments about my efforts. The way she always found a way to make everything about her. But at the time, I thought I was doing what any husband and father would do, putting my family first, even if it meant ignoring the red flags. At that time, our lives looked perfect on the surface. We had a nice house, 2 beautiful kids, and enough money to cover our bills and then some. But underneath, the foundation of our marriage was crumbling. Sarah and I were living separate lives, even though we shared the same roof. I kept telling myself it was just a phase, that once the kids were older, things would settle down, that Sarah would find her way back to being the woman I fell in love with. But deep down, I knew the truth. Sarah wasn't interested in building a life together anymore. She was only interested in taking what she could, and I was about to find out just how far she'd go to get what she wanted. Over time, the cracks in Sarah's facade grew harder to ignore. It started with the kids. Emma was only 7, bright and curious, with a knack for asking a million questions about everything. Ethan, at 4, was quieter, always shadowing me or clinging to his sister. They were good kids, messy, energetic, occasionally exhausting, but good. Sarah didn't seem to see it that way. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen to find Emma crying, her hands trembling as she tried to pick up pieces of a broken juice glass. Sarah stood over her, arms crossed, her face a mask of irritation. "Are you kidding me, Emma?" she shouted. "Do you even think before you do anything? Or do you just go around breaking things for fun?" I stepped in quickly, kneeling to scoop Emma into my arms. "It's just a glass," I said, my voice as calm as I could manage. "Accidents happen." Sarah shot me a look that could have frozen water. "You always make excuses for her," she said, shaking her head. "No wonder she's so careless." I tried to talk to her about it later, after the kids were in bed. "You can't talk to her like that," I said. "She's a child. She's going to make mistakes." Sarah waved me off. "You're too soft on them," she said. "They'll grow up weak if you keep coddling them." It wasn't an isolated incident. She became extremely verbally, emotionally, and sometimes physically abusive. I started working longer hours, not because I needed the money, but because being at home felt like walking into a minefield. Sarah's moods were unpredictable. Some days, she'd act like nothing was wrong, chatting with her friends on the phone, or planning elaborate vacations we couldn't afford. Other days, the smallest thing, a misplaced toy, a late start to dinner, would send her into a spiral of anger that left everyone on edge. The kids began tiptoeing around her, watching her face for clues about what kind of day it would be. I hated seeing them like that. It wasn't just fear, it was confusion. They didn't understand why their mom, the person who was supposed to love them unconditionally, could be so harsh. And then came what I should have expected, a betrayal. I started noticing hotel charge on our credit card. I was going over the monthly statement late one night when the line item caught my eye. $812 for a 2-night stay at an upscale hotel downtown. I stared at it, trying to remember if she had mentioned anything about a trip. Maybe it was part of the moms group she was always talking about. Maybe it was some sort of spa weekend. But deep down, something didn't feel right. The next day, I asked her about it casually, trying not to sound accusatory. "Hey, what's this hotel charge on the card? Were you away for something I forgot about?" Sarah didn't even blink. "Oh yeah," she said. "It was a girls' weekend with the moms group. We just needed a break from everything." Her answer was too quick, too rehearsed. My intuition told me she was lying, but I didn't press her right then. Instead, I waited until she left for another lunch with friends and started digging. It didn't take long to find the truth. A mutual acquaintance, someone I'd waved to at neighborhood barbecues, someone who had been in my home, had posted photos on social media, pictures of him and Sarah together at the same hotel. holding hands, smiling. I stared at the photos, my hands shaking. Sarah wasn't just smiling. She was glowing, holding hands with someone I had once called a friend. I closed the laptop, my chest tight with rage and betrayal. That night, I waited for her to come home, rehearsing what I would say, knowing this confrontation would change everything. That night, I confronted her. I showed her the photos, laid everything out, and waited for her to explain, to apologize, to at least try to justify what she'd done. She didn't. Instead, she rolled her eyes and crossed her arms. "So what?" she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Maybe if you weren't so boring, I wouldn't need to find excitement elsewhere." The words hit harder than I expected, not because they were true, but because of how little she cared about the hurt she'd caused. I slept on the couch that night, though sleep was a generous term. My mind raced, replaying every moment, every red flag I had ignored, every excuse I had made for her. By morning, my decision was clear. This wasn't a marriage, it wasn't even a partnership. It was a toxic, one-sided arrangement where I gave everything I had, and Sarah took without hesitation. When I told her I wanted a divorce, she didn't react with anger or sadness. She laughed. "Good luck," she said, her voice icy. "You'll never manage without me." But as she turned to walk away, I realized something. I already had been managing. I had been the one holding everything together while she tore it apart. And now, I was ready to let it go. Now here, the crazy thing started. They say divorce is the end of a battle, but for me, it was just the beginning of Sarah's last-ditch attempt to ruin everything I had left. Little did she know, her own mistakes would be her undoing. After Sarah left, the house felt both quieter and heavier. I thought her absence would bring peace, but instead, it brought a hollow kind of tension. The kids were my focus, and they were the only part of my life that felt stable. Everything else seemed to be unraveling. Sarah had always been difficult, but the divorce turned her into someone I barely recognized. She refused to cooperate on anything. Every decision became a battle. Splitting assets, arranging visitation, even figuring out who would keep the dog. For someone who always acted above it all, she was suddenly deeply invested in making my life miserable. She also refused to pay her share of the kids' expenses. When I asked her about splitting daycare or school costs, she'd reply with a smirk, "You wanted them more than I did. You figure it out." It wasn't just hurtful, it was infuriating. Money was tight. With our accounts frozen during the divorce process, I had to rely on friends and family to get by. Every paycheck went toward keeping the lights on and making sure the kids didn't feel the strain. I cut out everything unnecessary. Cable, eating out, even coffee on the way to work. Meanwhile, Sarah seemed to live exactly as she had before. It wasn't long before the kids started asking questions. "Why doesn't Mom live here anymore?" Emma asked one night. She was old enough to understand that something big had changed, but too young to grasp the full picture. I told her what I could. Sometimes grown-ups don't get along the way they should, and it's better for everyone if they live in separate places. Emma nodded, but her eyes were searching for something more. Ethan, on the other hand, didn't ask much. He just clung to me more tightly than ever. Through all of this, Sarah wasn't exactly making an effort to stay connected with the kids. She'd cancel visits last minute, claiming she was overwhelmed or busy with work, though what work she meant was anyone's guess. On the rare weekends she did take them, she treated it more like a chore than quality time. Emma came home once, confused and teary-eyed. "Mom said she didn't have time to play," she told me. "She was on her phone the whole time." I didn't know how to respond. How do you explain to a child that their parent sees them as an inconvenience? I tried my best to fill the gaps Sarah left, throwing myself into every school event, playdate, and bedtime story. It wasn't just for the kids. It was for me. They were my lifeline, the thing that kept me going when everything else felt like it was falling apart. The legal process dragged on longer than I ever imagined, costing me nearly $15,000 in lawyer fees and court appearances. Sarah's lawyer filed delay after delay, arguing over things that didn't even matter. I lost count of the number of nights I stayed up, going through documents and trying to make sense of what she wanted. It wasn't about fairness or even money. It was about control. Eventually, the court sided with me on most issues. I got primary custody of the kids, which felt like a victory, though a bittersweet one. Sarah was ordered to pay child support of $1,200, but she dragged her feet every step of the way. When the payments finally came, they were late and incomplete. One day, as I was going through the mail, I found a letter from her lawyer. Sarah was contesting the child support amount, claiming it was unfair. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. After everything, she still thought she deserved more. I didn't want to be angry. I didn't want to let her take up any more space in my life than she already had. But it was hard not to feel resentment creeping in. Every time I had to explain to the kids why their mom wasn't around, or figure out how to stretch the grocery budget, I felt the weight of what she'd left behind. At that time, I was devastated. My mom was my only supporter. She gave me a sense of relief being there for me. She constantly provided help. She visited each week and stayed until the evening, helping Emma with her homework and reading Ethan a bedtime story. Before leaving, she hugged me and tried to comfort me. "You're doing a great job, you know. We're proud of you." The kids began to look forward to their grandma's visits. Their bond with my mom strengthened, and that provided my kids a sense of family support that Sarah failed to offer. The first year after the divorce was rough, no sugarcoating it. Every day felt like a grind. I woke up early to get the kids ready for school, rushed to work, and then came home to pick them up, cook dinner, and squeeze in as much time with them as I could before bedtime. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest work, and it felt good to finally have control over my life again, even if that control came with a lot of responsibility. Work became my second anchor. My boss, who'd been understanding throughout the divorce, gave me flexibility when I needed it. I started taking on projects that excited me again, pouring my energy into creating things that made me proud. Financially, things were tight, but I learned to live within my means. I traded in Sarah's old luxury SUV for a reliable hatchback and canceled the memberships and subscriptions we didn't need. The first time I balanced my budget and saw a little left over, I felt a sense of accomplishment I hadn't felt in years. Around this time, I started opening myself up to the idea of dating again, though cautiously. It wasn't about replacing Sarah. It was about finding someone who shared the same values, someone who saw family as a partnership. I wasn't in a rush, but the idea of sharing my life with someone again didn't feel so impossible anymore. I met a wonderful girl, Jennifer, and eventually remarried after 1 year of the divorce and found the stability Sarah's chaos never allowed. Back then, I reviewed the court documents and noticed there was a box that would have stopped spousal support if I remarried, but it wasn't checked. So, I figured I was in the clear. I decided not to pursue a share of Sarah's retirement, even though I could have, dividing assets like a 401k, which would have legally entitled me to part of it. Instead, I let it go and just took the remaining year of spousal support, $12,000 in total. The support had only been ordered for 2 years, so it felt fair enough to me. I thought that chapter was closed for both of us. After a week, I received a letter from Sarah's lawyer, delivered on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I had just finished preparing dinner when I found the envelope sitting on the counter where Emma had left the mail. At first, I thought it was another delay tactic regarding her overdue child support. However, Sarah was suing for sole custody of Emma and Ethan. Her claims were as ridiculous as they were infuriating. According to the paperwork, I had manipulated the children into resenting her and had actively poisoned their relationship with her. Sarah demanded full custody, with me relegated to visitation every other weekend. She also wanted me to cover her legal fees, citing emotional distress caused by my supposed interference. When I shared the news with my lawyer, she wasn't surprised. "It's a textbook move," she said, "usually a way to regain leverage. She probably doesn't even want full custody. It's a power play." It didn't matter whether Sarah's motives were genuine or strategic. The thought of her taking the kids away, especially after everything we'd been through, was unbearable. Emma and Ethan, now 12 and 9, had grown up in a stable, loving environment since the divorce. Sarah had been in and out of their lives inconsistently, showing up when it suited her and canceling plans when it didn't. The weeks leading up to the hearing were filled with tension. I explained the situation to Emma and Ethan as gently as I could, without going into too much detail. "Mom wants to spend more time with you," I said carefully, "and the court is going to help us figure out what's best." In court, Sarah presented herself as a doting, devoted mother who had been unfairly pushed out of her children's lives. She claimed I had turned them against her and that she was simply trying to repair the damage I had caused. "I love my kids more than anything," she said, tears welling in her eyes, "but they've been brainwashed to hate me." Her demands were clear and aggressive. She wanted sole legal and physical custody, leaving me with minimal visitation. She also requested a reduction in her child support payments, arguing that she would be the primary caregiver and therefore shouldn't have to contribute financially. To top it off, she sought reimbursement for her legal fees, which were conveniently estimated at just under $15,000. The reality Sarah ignored was that her relationship with Emma and Ethan had faltered because of her own actions, or lack thereof. My lawyer presented a detailed timeline of Sarah's missed visitations, canceled plans, and sporadic involvement. We included text messages where she had bailed on weekends with excuses ranging from "I'm too tired" to "I need some me time." One message in particular caught the judge's attention. It was from a few months earlier when Sarah had canceled yet another weekend visit. I can't do this right now. Tell the kids I'll make it up to them, but I need to focus on myself for a bit. When it was my turn to testify, I focused on the kids. I described their routines, their schools, their hobbies. I talked about how Emma had started excelling in science and how Ethan had recently joined a soccer team. I explained how I had been the one attending parent-teacher conferences, taking them to doctor's appointments, and reading bedtime stories every night. The court also heard from Emma and Ethan directly, something I had been nervous about but ultimately agreed to because it was important for their voices to be heard. Emma's words were measured but powerful. "I love my mom," she said, looking directly at the judge, "but she doesn't really spend time with us. Dad's the one who's always there. He's the one who makes sure we're okay." Ethan, shy as always, spoke softly, but with conviction. "I want to stay with Dad," he said simply. Sarah's lawyer tried to discredit their statements, suggesting I had influenced their opinions. But the judge wasn't buying it. The facts were clear. Sarah's involvement in the kids' lives had been inconsistent at best, and her sudden push for custody felt more like an attempt to regain control than a genuine desire to be a better parent. The proceedings took weeks, during which Sarah's anger only grew. Remember, it was during one of these sessions that she discovered I had remarried a year earlier. She hadn't paid much attention to my personal life until that moment, but when my remarriage was brought up as part of a financial disclosure, her face turned red with fury. "You've been taking spousal support this whole time?" She hissed at me outside the courtroom. "You owe me that money." The irony was almost laughable. Sarah had failed to check the box during the divorce to end spousal support upon remarriage, a mistake entirely of her own making. But now, she acted as though I had stolen from her. The judge ultimately ruled in her favor on the spousal support repayment, ordering me to return the $12,000 I had received after remarrying. However, in the same breath, the judge increased Sarah's child support obligation to $2,200 a month. It ended up that I got extra $1,000 a month through minor adjustments, and she repaid herself by dropping her claim to my car. In return, I agreed to let her have 2 extra weeks of summer visitation with our kids, which seemed like a fair trade. When the final ruling was announced, Sarah's demeanor shifted. She dropped her demand for sole custody in exchange for 2 extra weeks with the kids during summer vacations. She framed it as a gracious compromise. "I'm doing this for the kids," she said with an air of martyrdom, as though she were making a noble sacrifice. For me, it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about preserving the life Emma and Ethan had come to know, a life filled with stability, love, and routine. Sarah's attempt to disrupt that had failed, but it left scars nonetheless. However, I kept in mind that Sarah wasn't the type to let go without taking one last shot. It started with a passing comment from my lawyer during a routine check-in. "You know, you're still entitled to half of Sarah's retirement account," she said, almost casually. I had waived my claim to it during the divorce, hoping to keep things amicable at the time. But after years of her games, unpaid child support, and relentless drama, I wondered if it was time to revisit that decision. At first, I hesitated. Going after Sarah's retirement felt like stirring up trouble when things were finally calm. But whenever I thought about it, it felt like the right thing to do. Not out of spite, but as a way to hold her accountable for years of reckless behavior. This wasn't about revenge. It was about fairness. When I filed the motion, Sarah's reaction was as explosive as I'd expected. She called me almost immediately. "Are you serious? You're coming after my retirement now? You really are pathetic." I stayed calm. "This is what I'm legally entitled to," I said. "It's not about you. It's about doing what's right for the kids and their future." Sarah, of course, didn't see it that way. She mocked me at every turn, calling me bitter, petty, and obsessed. During one particularly heated exchange in court, she said, "This is why you'll never be happy. You can't let things go." Her tactics to delay the process were relentless. She ignored court orders, claimed she didn't have the funds, and dragged the case out for years. At one point, she even argued that she had spent most of the account, though bank statements quickly disproved that claim. Each court hearing felt like a battle. Sarah would arrive with her usual smugness, often making snide comments loud enough for me to hear. "Still chasing crumbs?" she said once, smirking as she walked past me. But I stayed focused. I wasn't there to engage with her games. I was there to secure what was owed, not just for me, but for the future I was building for Emma and Ethan. Finally, after nearly 4 years, the court ruled in my favor. I was awarded 50% of Sarah's retirement account, a figure that ended up being significantly larger than I'd anticipated. I had expected around $12,000 based on the original estimates, but after reviewing the updated statements, the court ordered Sarah to pay me just over $48,000. The news didn't sit well with Sarah or her new fiancé, who had entered the picture during the latter half of the proceedings. He sent me an email shortly after the ruling, accusing me of ruining their future and calling me vindictive. My response was simple. Sarah made her choices, and these are the consequences. I told him that if he really wanted to marry her and protect his assets, they could get a prenup so he wouldn't have to worry about it. He said he shouldn't have to sign a prenup because I robbed them. I didn't give him that much thought. Last thing I wanted to care about was Sarah's stuff. The payout allowed me to do something I dreamed of for years. Set up college savings accounts for Emma and Ethan. It wasn't enough to cover everything, but it was a start. Knowing that I could give them a better foundation for their futures was worth every frustrating moment in court. As for Sarah, the ruling hit her harder than I think she ever expected. Her social media, once filled with pictures of extravagant outings and updates about her dream wedding, became quieter. Mutual friends mentioned she had started complaining about financial stress, though I didn't pay much attention. For me, life moved on in the best way possible. Jennifer and I continued to grow together, building a home filled with love and stability. Emma blossomed into a confident teenager, excelling in school and dreaming of becoming a writer. Ethan found his footing on the soccer field, his quiet determination shining through in every game. One evening, as we sat around the dinner table, Ethan asked, "Dad, are you happy now?" The question made me realize just how far we'd come. "Yeah," I said, smiling at him. "I really am." Looking back, Sarah's choices had always been about taking money, taking time, taking control. But life has a way of balancing the scales. Her greed, her refusal to take responsibility, it all came back to her in the end. For me, it wasn't about winning. It was about creating a life where my kids could thrive, where they could feel loved and supported, and where we could move forward without the weight of Sarah's chaos dragging us down. In the end, Sarah's greed led her to exactly where she is now, on the outside looking in. And while I don't celebrate her struggles, I don't pity her either. You play greedy games, you win greedy prizes. But for me and my family, we've won something far greater. We've won peace.
I never thought a regular Saturday dinner at my parents' house would mark the beginning of such a dramatic change in our family's life. But there I was, sitting at the familiar oak dining table, when my older sister dropped the bombshell that would set everything in motion. "I've decided to sell my apartment," Amanda announced, barely containing her excitement. "We're going to open our own Italian restaurant." I nearly choked on my mashed potatoes. The apartment she was talking about wasn't just any property, it was a luxury 3-bedroom condo in the heart of the city, the one our grandmother had left her in her will. Her husband Mike nodded enthusiastically, his fork waving in the air as he spoke. "I know everything there is to know about Italian cuisine. And Amanda has restaurant experience, so we're perfectly qualified." I watched as my parents' faces lit up with admiration. Mom clasped her hands together in delight, while Dad beamed with pride. "That's such a wonderful idea, honey," Mom exclaimed. "You've always had such a good head for business." But something didn't sit right with me. Call me boring, and trust me, I've been called worse, but being a financial manager means I can't help but think about the practical side of things. "Have you actually calculated all the risks?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Maybe it would be better to take out a business loan instead of selling your only property?" Amanda rolled her eyes. "Here we go again. Classic Nellie, always overthinking everything. Do you at least have a business plan?" I pressed on, glancing at her kids, 5-year-old Tommy and 2-year-old Lisa, who were playing with their toys in the living room. "You have 2 small children to think about. If things don't work out, buying another apartment won't be easy." "Oh, please," Amanda scoffed. "You don't understand anything about business opportunities. In today's economy, you have to take risks to get ahead. You can't just sit around waiting for success to fall into your lap." "But your restaurant experience," I started, remembering how she'd only worked as an administrator for a few months before Tommy was born. "It was pretty brief, wasn't it?" "God, you're so boring." Amanda threw her hands up in exasperation. "This is exactly why you're still single, Nellie. You never take any chances." I sat there, pushing the remains of my dinner around my plate, listening to them spin their fantasy of success. Not once did they mention the possibility of failure, of things going wrong. Not once did they consider what would happen if their dream restaurant didn't work out. An hour later, I pulled into the driveway of my small house, Grand's house really, though she'd been gone for 3 years now. As I unlocked the front door, my mind wandered back to her final days and how she'd divided her property between my sister and me. Amanda had practically camped out at Grand's hospital bed, going on and on about how perfect the luxury apartment would be for her future family. I remember Gran looking at me apologetically as she explained her decision to leave me the house instead. "You've always been practical, just like me," she'd said, squeezing my hand with what little strength she had left. "This house isn't fancy, but it's paid for and full of love. You'll appreciate its value more than anyone else could." Sitting in my cozy living room now, surrounded by Gran's old furniture that I couldn't bear to replace, I couldn't help but think about how history kept repeating itself with Amanda. The memory of her childhood tantrums came flooding back, the time she screamed for 2 hours straight because Mom bought her the wrong color bicycle, or when she threw herself on the floor of the mall because Dad wouldn't buy her a second pair of designer jeans. There was also that memorable Christmas when she refused to speak to anyone for 3 days because she got the previous year's iPhone model instead of the latest one. Our parents had nod along to whatever scheme she cooked up, praising her creativity and ambition while dismissing my concerns as negativity. Even when she dropped out of college because classes were boring and she wanted to find herself, they supported her decision wholeheartedly. I made myself a cup of tea in Gran's old porcelain cup, trying to push these thoughts aside. I had my own life to focus on, my job at Henderson Financial was demanding but rewarding, and I had a major project presentation coming up that could lead to a promotion. Our team was working on restructuring a client's investment portfolio, and I needed to be sharp. Amanda's restaurant dreams weren't my problem, and dwelling on them wouldn't change anything. But exactly 1 month later, my phone rang during my lunch break, just as I was reviewing the final numbers for my presentation. Mom's name flashed on the screen, and I felt a strange sense of foreboding. "Nellie, you won't believe it," she practically squealed, her voice high with excitement. "They did it. They sold the apartment and found the perfect location for the restaurant. It's right on Madison Street, you know, where all those trendy places are. Mike is already working on the menu. He's got such wonderful ideas, fusion Italian cuisine, can you imagine? And Amanda, oh, you should see her Instagram posts about the restaurant. She's going to be such a successful businesswoman. She's already got over 1,000 followers for the restaurant page." I gripped my phone tighter, feeling my knuckles turn white. "Where are they living now?" "They found a nice rental," Mom replied breezily, as if they hadn't just sold their only real estate asset. "I'm watching Tommy and Lisa while they get everything set up. It's so exciting. They're talking about having a big grand opening party next month." I stared at the financial report on my desk, thinking about the massive risk my sister had just taken. The statistics about restaurant failures in their first year flashed through my mind. I'd looked them up after that dinner, and they weren't pretty. 2 months passed in a blur of work deadlines and quiet evenings at home before I received Amanda's message. The invitation popped up on my Instagram feed, an elaborate digital card with gold lettering announcing the grand opening of Bella Italia. I had to admit, it looked professional. When I arrived at the address on Madison Street that Saturday evening, I was actually impressed. The storefront had been transformed with elegant lighting and window boxes full of fresh herbs. Inside, the decor was warm and inviting, exposed brick walls, dark wood tables, and strings of twinkling lights crisscrossing the ceiling. "Nellie, you came." Amanda rushed over in a designer dress that probably cost more than a month's worth of rent. She air-kissed my cheeks, champagne glass wobbling in her hand. The place was packed with familiar faces, cousins, aunts, uncles, old family friends, and Mike's entire extended family. Mom and Dad were holding court near the bar, Dad's voice carrying across the room as he gestured enthusiastically. "Just wait and see," I overheard him telling Uncle Jim. "Amanda's going to be the next big name in the restaurant business. She's got that entrepreneurial spirit, you know? Not like Nellie, she'll probably work for other people until she retires." Mom nodded along. Some people are just born leaders, and others, well, they're more comfortable following. I pretended not to hear them as I made my way to the appetizer table. Their words didn't sting as much as they might have once. I'd long ago accepted that I'd never be the daughter they bragged about at family gatherings. "Congratulations," I told Amanda sincerely, raising my glass. "The place looks beautiful. I hope it's a huge success." The next few months fell into a pattern. Every Sunday dinner at our parents' house became a progress report on Bella Italia. Amanda would sweep in, sometimes with the kids and Mike, sometimes just with Tommy and Lisa in tow, and dominate the conversation with tales of her budding restaurant empire. "That's our girl," Dad would beam. "Always knew she had it in her to be a successful entrepreneur. It's in her blood." Mom would inevitably chime in with, "Not everyone has that drive," shooting meaningful glances my way. Amanda would smirk at me across the table, that same superior look she'd had since we were kids, and she'd gotten her way yet again. But one evening, when the conversation turned to actual numbers, I couldn't help myself. "How's the revenue looking?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "Are you hitting your projected targets?" Amanda's smile faltered for a split second. "Oh, you know how it is with new restaurants," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "We're still building our customer base. But we'll be self-sufficient any day now, and then the profits will really start rolling in." Something in her voice made me think of a time in high school when she'd insisted everything was fine with her grades, right up until she failed 3 classes. But I kept that thought to myself and just nodded, taking another bite of Mom's pot roast. The spring evening started like any other Sunday dinner, with Mom's cooking filling the house with familiar aromas and Dad telling his same old jokes. Then Amanda cleared her throat and grabbed Mike's hand. "We have some news," she announced, beaming. "I'm pregnant. Baby number 3 is on the way." Mom burst into tears of joy, Dad started talking about another grandchild to spoil, and Mike sat there grinning like he'd just won the lottery. Tommy and Lisa jumped around the table, chanting, "Baby, baby." I set down my fork, choosing my words carefully. "Are you sure this is the best timing? With the restaurant still getting established and everything?" The room went silent. You'd think I'd just suggested selling Tommy and Lisa to the circus. "Nellie," Mom's voice could have cut glass. "How dare you? A baby is always a blessing." Besides, she added with that particular tone she reserved for discussing my personal life, "You'd understand if you had any children of your own. Or a husband. You're 30 now, you know. Not getting any younger." 8 months later, little Emily joined the family. She was beautiful, with Amanda's blue eyes and Mike's dark hair. But while everyone was cooing over the new addition, I couldn't help but notice the strain showing around my sister's eyes, the way Mike kept checking his phone with an increasingly worried expression. The truth finally came out 3 months after Emily's birth, during another family dinner. Amanda looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes visible despite her makeup, while Mike had traded his usual confident swagger for nervous fidgeting. "We're having some challenges at the restaurant," Amanda admitted, pushing her food around her plate. The word seemed to physically pain her. "The staff turnover is killing us. We've gone through 6 different head chefs because Mike keeps wanting to innovate with the menu." She took a shaky breath. "We've had to take out a business loan just to keep things running. The numbers they're not what we projected." I sat there in silence, remembering all my questions about their business plan from that first dinner. The loan they should have taken instead of selling the apartment. The risks I'd warned them about. But I didn't say any of it. The next 6 months were like watching a slow-motion car crash. Every week brought new problems at Bella Italia. First, the lunch crowd dwindled to nothing. Then the evening reservations started to dry up. The restaurant's Instagram page, once full of beautifully plated dishes and smiling customers, went quiet. The last post was a sad 2-for-1 Tuesday promotion that got 3 likes. I heard most of it through Mom's daily phone calls to update me on the situation. How they had to let go of half the staff. How they started closing on Mondays to cut costs. How Mike got into a shouting match with their last remaining chef over putting sushi rolls on their Italian menu. They're just having a rough patch, Mom would insist. Every new business goes through this. But it wasn't just a rough patch. By spring, the writing was on the wall in bright, neon letters. The restaurant's debts had piled up like autumn leaves, unpaid suppliers, late rent, mounting tax bills. The final blow came when their main investor pulled out, leaving them with no choice but to sell Bella Italia for a fraction of what they'd invested. The sale barely covered their business debts. They still owed the bank nearly $200,000 from the loan they'd taken out. Amanda, Mike, and their 3 kids, Tommy now 8, Lisa 5, and little Emily just turning 1, were left with nothing. No home, no income, and a mountain of debt. I almost skipped the next Saturday dinner. Something in Mom's voice when she called to remind me about it set off warning bells. But I went anyway, pulling up to their house just as the spring sun was setting. The atmosphere hit me the moment I walked in. Mom and Dad sat ramrod straight in their usual chairs. Amanda and Mike were there too, the kids playing quietly in the corner, unusually subdued for them. Emily was asleep in her carrier, while Tommy and Lisa seemed to sense the tension in the room, focusing intently on their tablets. I hadn't even settled properly into my chair when Dad cleared his throat. "Nellie, we've made a decision." The way he said "we" made my stomach clench. "Your sister and her family need a place to stay," Mom jumped in. "You have that big house all to yourself." I felt like I'd walked into an ambush. "What?" "We need to move in with you," Amanda stated, as if she was telling me the weather forecast. "Temporarily, of course." My mouth went dry. How long is temporarily?" Amanda shrugged, examining her perfectly manicured nails, probably her last professional manicure for a while, I thought hysterically. "Hard to say. I can't work, obviously. Not with 3 small children to take care of. And Mike needs time to find the right position." "I'm not going to flip burgers somewhere," Mike interjected, puffing up his chest. "I was a business owner. I need something at an executive level." "So we'll need to stay with you for a few years," Amanda continued, as if discussing borrowing a cup of sugar. "It's not like you're using all that space anyway. And let's be honest, Nellie, you're not getting any younger. The chances of you getting married and having kids are getting pretty slim. You're already 30, and you spend all your time working." I sat there, stunned into silence by my sister's breathtaking arrogance. The casual cruelty of her words hung in the air like poison, made worse by our parents' nodding heads. Mom and Dad were actually agreeing with her, as if my single status and career somehow made me responsible for fixing their mistakes. I pushed my chair back and stood up, the leg scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that made everyone jump. "No." "What do you mean, no?" Amanda asked, genuine confusion in her voice. The concept of me refusing her anything was apparently foreign to her. "I mean no. You're not moving into my house." My voice was steady, calmer than I felt. "Not for a few years, not for a few months, not at all." The silence that followed was deafening. I could actually hear the tick of Mom's ancient kitchen clock, marking the seconds. Tommy and Lisa looked up from their tablets, sensing the tension in the room. Even baby Emily stirred in her carrier. Then the explosion came. "How dare you?" Mom shrieked, her face turning red. "They're your family. Your own flesh and blood. You selfish, heartless witch." Amanda joined in, tears already starting to flow. "My children will be homeless because of you." Dad slammed his hand on the table, making the dishes rattle. "I never thought I raised such a cruel, uncaring daughter." "These are your nephews and niece we're talking about. You've always been jealous of your sister," Mike added, wrapping an arm around my sobbing sister. "You're probably happy we failed." I let them rant, watching as they worked themselves into a righteous fury. The accusations flew thick and fast. I was heartless, cruel, selfish, bitter, jealous. A terrible aunt. A disappointment as a daughter. A failure as a woman. When they finally ran out of steam, I spoke, my voice still perfectly calm. You know who could take them in? You could, Mom and Dad. Since you supported their brilliant business plan so enthusiastically. Since you cheered them on when they sold their only home. Since you told them what a wonderful idea it all was. Mom's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Dad started to sputter something about their house being too small, but I cut him off. I warned you all, I continued, reaching for my coat. I warned you about selling the apartment. I warned you about starting a business without a proper plan. I warned you about the risks. Not one of you listened. Not one of you even considered that I might know what I was talking about. And now that everything I predicted has come true, you expect me to clean up your mess? I buttoned my coat with steady hands. You made your decisions. All of you. You chose not to listen to reason. You chose to ignore every warning sign. You chose to risk everything on a dream with no foundation. And now you're facing the consequences of those choices. I walked out into the cool evening air, closing the door on their protests. As I got into my car, I could still hear them shouting through the windows, their voices a chorus of outrage and disbelief. The harassment started within hours of me leaving my parents' house. First came the guilt trip texts from Mom, how can you sleep at night knowing your nieces and nephew might end up homeless? Then Dad's angry voicemails about family duty and responsibility. Amanda alternated between tearful pleas and vicious attacks, while Mike sent long, rambling messages about how I was destroying his children's future. I blocked their numbers after the first week, but they just switched to email. Then social media. Then they started having other family members contact me. Aunt Susan called to tell me I was breaking my mother's heart. Cousin Rachel sent me a 5-paragraph Facebook message about how karma would get me. Uncle Jim cornered me outside my office to lecture me about family values. I weathered it all, focusing on my work and the peace of my home. But I wasn't naive. I knew my family well enough to know they wouldn't just accept my refusal. That's why I'd called a locksmith the very next day after that disastrous dinner. The locks were changed, a security system was installed, and cameras were placed at strategic points around the house. Smart thinking, as it turned out. I was driving home from work one Wednesday evening when I saw them. Amanda, Mike, and the kids were camped out on my front porch, surrounded by suitcases and boxes. Tommy was sitting on a large duffel bag, looking bored. Lisa was crying, and Emily was fussy in her carrier. Mike was jiggling my doorknob with what I assumed was my mother's spare key. I pulled into my driveway and got out of my car, unable to suppress a laugh at the scene before me. They all turned at the sound. Something funny? Mike snarled, still trying to force the key into the lock. Actually, yes, I replied, leaning against my car. Did you really think I wouldn't change the locks after that dinner? The alarm system's nice too, it's already sent 3 notifications to my phone about attempted entry. Amanda stepped forward, her face twisted with anger. You can't just leave us out here. We're your family. You're trespassing, I corrected her. And if you don't leave immediately, I'll call the police. I pulled out my phone to demonstrate I wasn't bluffing. You wouldn't dare, Mike growled, taking a threatening step toward me. I held up my phone, showing them the 911 already dialed, my thumb hovering over the call button. Try me. They stared at me for a long moment, probably searching for any sign of weakness or uncertainty. They found none. Finally, Amanda burst into tears, real ones this time, not her usual performance, and started gathering up their things. Mike helped her, muttering threats under his breath. The kids just looked confused and tired. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years. I spent the day visiting rental properties in decent neighborhoods, finally finding a clean, spacious 3-bedroom apartment in a good school district. The landlord was understandably hesitant about renting to a family with 3 young kids, but the 6 months' rent I paid in advance, nearly $20,000 from my savings, helped change his mind. The next morning, I drove to my parents' house, the apartment keys feeling heavy in my pocket. It was early, but I knew they'd all be there. They always gathered for Saturday breakfast, a tradition that used to include me too. The room fell silent when I walked in. Mom nearly dropped the pancake plate, and Dad's newspaper crinkled as his hands tightened on it. "Here," I said, placing the keys and a folder on the table. "It's a 3-bedroom apartment on Cedar Street. Good neighborhood, walking distance to the elementary school. I paid 6 months' rent in advance." Amanda stared at the keys like they might bite her. Mike didn't even look up from his phone. "The lease starts today," I continued, my voice steady. "I've already talked to the landlord. He knows you have 3 kids. There's a playground in the complex, and the building has a laundry room on each floor." I turned to Mike specifically. "You have 6 months to find a job, any job. Pride doesn't pay bills or feed children. When the lease ends, you'll need to either renew it yourselves or find another place. This is the only help I'm offering." Nobody spoke. Tommy and Lisa had stopped fighting over the syrup and were watching with wide eyes. Even Emily seemed to sense the tension. Her tiny hand paused midway to her mouth with a piece of pancake. "That's it?" Amanda finally asked, her voice bitter. "You think throwing money at us makes up for turning your back on family?" I looked at my sister, really looked at her. The entitled teenager who always got her way had grown into an entitled adult who never learned to face consequences. "No," I replied calmly. "The money doesn't make up for anything. It's just the right thing to do. What happens next is up to you." Mom started to say something, probably another lecture about family duty, but I held up my hand. "I'm done. I helped because those kids deserve a stable home, but I'm not enabling this behavior anymore. You all made your choices. Now you have to live with them." I left without waiting for a response. As I drove home, I caught myself smiling, not because I was happy about the situation, but because for the first time in my life, I felt truly free of their expectations and manipulation. 3 months have passed since then. According to Aunt Susan, who still talks to me, albeit disapprovingly, Amanda and her family are living in the apartment I rented. Mike still hasn't found a job. Apparently, being a former restaurant owner makes him too good for regular work. Amanda spends most of her time complaining on social media about how hard her life is. Mom and Dad continue to enable them, watching the kids and bringing them groceries. I haven't spoken to any of them since that morning. I've started taking evening classes in investment management, something I'd always wanted to do but never had the emotional energy for before. Last week, I got a promotion at work, senior financial manager with my own team.
So here's the deal. I just turned 18 a little over a week ago. On my birthday, instead of throwing a party like most parents might do, mine sat me down and dropped a bombshell. I needed to start paying rent if I wanted to keep living under their roof. I was caught off guard because this topic had never come up before. My relationship with my parents has always been distant. We never really talked, and they were never the affectionate type. Growing up, everything I needed was provided for, but there was always this sense that it was out of obligation rather than genuine care. Nowadays, I wouldn't say we have the closest bond. My mom teaches high school English, and my dad works in marketing, so money isn't exactly tight for them. But I've always felt like they weren't thrilled about spending money on me. It was more about fulfilling a duty than wanting to provide things I actually wanted. Just to be on the safe side, I decided to get a job in high school. It was just the job of an intern at the nearby office supply store, but it paid decently and I could manage it alongside school. So I had no complaints, and I had even saved up some money for myself. I wouldn't say that I had enough to move out, but I could at least cover rent for the first couple of months if I stayed somewhere extremely cheap or split it with roommates. I didn't know about the other costs, though. These were measures that I'd only taken for the worst-case scenario, but I didn't really think that I would actually have to end up utilizing this money so soon. On my birthday, when my parents told me that I could either start paying rent or move out of their house, I decided to move out. It was insulting enough that they had just been waiting for me to be a legal adult so they could kick me out. I didn't need to be reminded of that by staying in that house. So, in a fit of anger, I decided to pack my stuff and go to a friend's house for the night. My parents didn't even try to stop me, so I left and haven't gone back since. It came out of nowhere because even though my parents had always been very less inclined to spend money on me, they'd never tried to make me leave so openly. My friend was kind enough to let me live with him until I'd be able to find an apartment, or at least until college started. I'm supposed to start college in the fall, and thankfully I didn't have to worry about the tuition because my maternal grandparents had a college fund for me which my parents couldn't touch. My dad's parents passed away when he was a teenager. I was very angry and upset about what my parents had said, so I blocked them as soon as I left, and I had no intention of unblocking them either. Like I said, we weren't really close, but I expected them to at least have the common decency to let me live in their house until I was able to afford my own place. I knew that they weren't obliged to look out for me now that I was an adult, but it still hurt. On the fourth day, I received a call from my grandparents, and they asked me to visit. I realized that they had no idea what had happened, so I visited them and told them everything. They'd always known that my parents weren't the most emotionally available people when it came to me, but they were livid when I told them about my parents insisting that I either pay rent or leave. They told me that it was outrageous and they couldn't accept behavior of this sort. They asked me to move in with them like they had several times before, but I refused yet again. My grandparents were old, and I didn't want to be an extra burden on them. My grandpa had a furniture company, and they were pretty comfortable financially, so it wasn't that which I was worried about. But my grandpa was suffering from Parkinson's, and my grandma had enough to deal with as it is. I didn't want to pile on and add more to her plate. I knew that they would have loved to have me there with them, but I cared too much about my grandparents to impose my presence on them. Besides, now that I was an adult, I couldn't just rely on them for help, and I had to make something of myself for the future. That's why I refused to move in with them, which disappointed them a little, but they understood where I was coming from. For me, it was just good enough that they'd even offered to let me live with them, because not a lot of people have that kind of heart, especially not the kind of people I grew up with. Not my parents, for sure. They told me that I could ask them for whatever help that I needed, and they'd be there for me, which meant a lot. I visited my grandparents at least once a week, but after that, I got kind of busy looking for apartments to move into because there was still a good few months to go before college started. Then yesterday, I received a call from my parents. My dad was using his business number because that was the only one that I'd forgotten to block. When I answered the call, I realized that both my parents were on the line to talk to me. They informed me that my grandparents had decided to back out of an investment on account of what I told them, and now my parents were panicking, because this was my father's business that he was going to start in a couple of months. My mother had convinced my grandpa with great difficulty to come on board as an investor, but as soon as he learned what my parents had said to me, he backed out of the deal. Apparently, my father's new business idea was also the reason he was asking me to pay rent, because then he would have another source of money as well, and would end up saving a lot. So that money could eventually go into his business, and now they wanted my grandpa to come back on board, and I was the only person who could manage that. So they wanted to let me speak to him and bring him back. I told them that I wasn't going to do anything because this was their own fault. They'd been horrible to me not just recently, but for most of my life, and had made me feel like a burden literally constantly. So now they really had no right to expect anything of me. They dug their own grave, and now they had to lie in it. I was just about to disconnect the call when my mother told me how unfair and ungrateful I was being. She told me that all through my life it had been them who had paid for everything, and now that I had a little money of my own, I was turning my back on them. They told me that this was apparently my fault somehow because they really hadn't considered that I would end up leaving and moving out. She told me that the only reason they even expected and asked me to pay rent was because I could afford to, and they knew it, and apparently they weren't even going to ask me for much, but they didn't even get to the amount because I stormed off in such a rage. My mother almost started crying and told me that she knew they hadn't been the best parents, but that didn't mean that they didn't care for me, and the way I was acting right now made them feel as if they'd done something wrong. My dad told me that it was up to me what I wanted to do, but reminded me that this business that he was about to start was his dream project, and he would be shattered if it didn't come through only because they had asked me to do something as simple as pay rent, which was something a lot of parents all over the country do anyway without consequences. They told me to think about it and let them know within a week. And now I obviously feel like a horrible human being, and I have no idea what to do. ATA for moving out when my parents gave me an ultimatum to either move out or pay rent. Update 1. So, okay, I don't think I'm going to go back and apologize to my parents like I was planning to. My emotions just got the better of me that day, I guess. Now that I've thought about things with a clearer head and also read the comments on my post, I don't really think that I owe it to them to go back or apologize or speak to my grandparents and make everything right. I still have 2 days before I have to let them know about my decision, but I've already made up my mind, and I also know that they're not going to take this kindly. My mother was pretty emotional, but now that I think of it, the tears could have been fake just as easily. I couldn't see them, so who's to say if she was really crying or just pretending to cry? It sounds very cynical, but honestly, I don't trust my parents one bit, and it's not like they've done anything to remedy that situation. I haven't yet talked to my grandparents about this because I don't want to make it seem like I'm getting too involved in something that doesn't concern me. I have, however, to discuss the situation with my friends, and they think that whatever I'm doing is completely justified. My parents were the ones who started this fight, so now they can't just shift the blame onto me and expect me to be okay with it. They need to take accountability for their own actions. Update 2. Okay, so I have to tell my parents tomorrow about my decision, and today I decided to talk to my grandparents about this. I know I said that I was feeling good about my decision in the last update, but I feel like I have way too much of a conscience to just do this and not feel guilty about shattering my father's dreams. It's dramatic, I know, but that's exactly the way he put it. Now I don't know if that was for effect or if he really feels that way about his new business. When I talked to my grandparents about that phone call with my parents, they told me that I had nothing to worry about or feel guilty about. They said that after they learned from me about the ultimatum, they'd already made up their minds to back out of the deal. And now nothing was going to change that. It wasn't just me, but there were a couple of other factors as well that had led to them stepping down as investors in the business. They didn't even trust my father and had only come on board because of my mother. But now even that trust has been broken, and you just can't build a business without trust. That helped me with the guilt because either way, I couldn't have convinced my grandparents to come back on board with the deal. So this is technically really not my fault. It's their own. Update 3. Today I told my parents about my decision, and I don't know why I had even expected them to take it reasonably. I decided to break the news to them on the phone because I didn't want to risk more drama by turning up at their house. When I called them, my mother answered her phone and she sounded really excited. So I decided not to give them any false hope by beating around the bush and told her straight away that I decided not to talk to my grandparents and convinced them to come back on board. I told them my reasons as well and made sure that they knew the entire truth so they couldn't delude themselves into believing that they were somehow not at fault here. There were about 1,000 different ways that they could have gone about the situation without insulting me and making me feel small for not wanting to pay rent. Told them that the real reason I'd even started working at the age of 16 was because of them, because I didn't feel safe enough to rely on them and trust them. I knew that at some point they would want me out of their house, so I started working and saving up so I could move out at the earliest. They hadn't even bothered to think about college and set anything aside for me. I'm not saying that they were obliged to, but they were my parents and they could afford to do so. All my friends' parents were paying for their tuition, and I was the only one who was relying on my grandparents for it. They'd never ever made me feel like I could count on them, be it financially or even emotionally. And to be fair, they'd given me the choice to move out, so I just took them up on their own offer, and now they couldn't complain about it. I didn't owe it to them to talk to my grandparents and clear the air between them. Why should it be my problem if my dad doesn't get to live his dream of being a businessman when it wasn't his problem to think about where I would live if they demanded rent for me out of money that I was saving for my future? After I was done ranting, my dad told me that I was a huge disappointment and that he regretted even talking to me and hoping that I'd be reasonable about this whole thing. He told me that he felt like a failure because he'd raised an egoistic and self-centered jerk as a son, and there was nothing in the world that could bring him more shame than my behavior. I guess I shouldn't have, but I decided to take it up a notch and told my father that he didn't need to feel ashamed because he hadn't raised me to be this way. To be honest, he hadn't raised me at all, so he had nothing to worry about. That set him off, so I just put him on speaker and went on with breakfast while he screamed at me and my mother tried to calm him down. It was kind of entertaining for a while until he started accusing me of using them for money all these years. I don't understand what the heck that was about because I was literally just a child and they were my parents, so they were actually legally required to take care of me. So it wasn't as if they were doing me any favors by letting me stay in their house and giving me food to eat. They neglected me emotionally, and they would have done so financially as well had it not been the law that was stopping them from ignoring my existence altogether and leaving me to fend for myself. I told my father that I couldn't have been using him for money because up until a couple of days ago, I was legally still a minor, so he had to pay for my well-being within his means. And even then, I would try my very best not to ask him for money and use my savings for things that I would need, even if it was something as simple as sneakers. For the past few years, ever since I started working at the store, I've been paying for myself and trying to make myself as scarce as possible so as not to bother my parents, but even that didn't seem to be enough for them, and they constantly wanted more and more. So that turned into a pretty brutal argument, and he called me a lot of things, and so did my mother. And by the time I disconnected the call, I was pretty emotionally broken. I didn't know how to cope with it on my own, and I didn't want to disturb my friend because he worked late into the night and slept till late as well. He was already doing me a huge favor by letting me live with him without paying rent. I wasn't about to bother him with this burden as well, so I decided to call the only people who I knew I could rely on without a second thought. My grandparents answered the call almost immediately. I pretty much broke down into tears while telling them about my conversation with my parents that I had just before that. They seemed to be upset by the things that my parents had said to me as well, and said that they would fix the situation. I didn't understand what that meant, and I didn't want to ask either because I was sure that whatever my grandparents did will be for the best. Of course, my grandparents knew better than to try and reconcile me with my parents, so it was definitely not going to be that. They still haven't told me exactly what they're going to do, but I'm sure that it's not going to be something pleasant because of their tone. I could tell that they were not at all pleased with my parents and they were going to come down on them hard. I'm actually kind of excited about what's going to happen now. Update 4. Okay, so 2 days ago I told my grandparents about the very horrible phone call with my parents, and they told me that they would fix the situation. If you guys remember well, they finally fixed it today, and I've got to say I wasn't expecting this. They made a post on social media talking about how my parents had taken money from them for years on end just to be able to put food on the table while I was a child, and yet they seemed to have no gratitude for that and even had the audacity to mistreat me and treat me like a burden when their own parents had never done the same. Apparently, even the house that they lived in belonged to a friend of my grandparents who'd allowed them to live there at a lower rent thanks to my grandpa. so they really had no right to accuse me of using them for money when they'd done the very same thing to my grandparents when they just had me. At least I was still a kid. They were well into adulthood and even had a child, but was still incapable of scraping by on their own. Not only that, but I also found out that my parents would use me as an excuse to borrow excessive amounts of money from my grandparents when I was a baby. My grandparents knew that they were being scammed out of money, but they still went on giving and giving because they actually cared about their daughter. And today they were heartbroken to learn that my mother was not even capable of doing the same for her own son and thought that her husband was somehow more important than her son. They announced what a no-good idiot my father was back when I was a child, which is why they didn't want to invest in his business in the first place. He already tried to start 2 businesses when I was younger, but they didn't work, and my grandparents had to bail him out of those situations and pay off his debts. They didn't want to end up having to do that yet again, which is another reason that they backed out of the deal. So I guess now it finally makes sense why my grandparents were so hesitant to invest in my parents' business, and it's completely fair as well. Their post has received a lot of attention from my relatives and their friends, and I think I'm going to share it so that more people can see it and know how awful my parents are. So far, I haven't received any word from my parents. I'm guessing that they've seen the post, but just hadn't been able to come up with an adequate response to it because all of it is true. After all, I bet they regret being so heartless with me on the phone the other day. Had they just let me go peacefully, then they wouldn't have so much to deal with. Update 5. Well, it's been a week since my grandparents posted, and pretty much the entire family has cut my parents off. My grandparents told me that they got into a huge fight with my parents that evening after my mother showed up with my father at their house. They came there to confront my grandparents and make them take that post down somehow, but my grandparents weren't there in the slightest and stood their ground, because they knew that they were the reason my parents even had the audacity to come and confront them like this. Obviously, they were pretty nasty towards my grandparents as well and cursed them out pretty badly. But my grandparents didn't take it too hard because they knew that this was exactly what they could expect from people like them. They've been relentlessly trying to get that post down and have even sent my grandpa a defamation lawsuit because they're losing business due to that post, which has gained a lot of attention by now. I will literally never understand how my parents managed to take everything and then blame it on somebody else instead of just taking accountability for once in their lives. I think that they're physically incapable of acknowledging that they messed up and apologizing for it. They haven't contacted me yet, which I think is a good sign because it means that they're finally done bothering me. I've also spoken to my friend because recently I found an apartment that I could share with 2 roommates and the rent was minimal, so I could afford it. I talked to him about moving out, but to my surprise, he told me that I could live with him for as long as I needed to. Apparently, he'd read the post that I shared and he strongly believed that I should be saving money for the future because my parents were never going to come around and start helping me. They would always do their best to drag me down. He was a few years older than me and had been working for almost a year already. His parents gave him allowances now and then so he could easily afford to let me stay with him for a while. I feel really lucky to have a friend like him because it's rare to find such generous people in today's competitive world. I guess I hit the jackpot when it comes to having amazing friends and family.